Good evening, guys. I hope you are enjoying this class. I hope you are enjoying philosophy. So we will be doing these lectures in addition to everything else. And the idea is, well, for one thing, I don't know if you noticed, but in-class discussions, they have PowerPoints. You don't see much of me there, and they are generally much longer, right? We go into much more details in these discussions, and of course, if you're in section 3001, I do want you to watch them as well and participate in them. If you are in other sections, then you can't participate in them, but I still would like for you to watch them. However, I realize that it may be a lot of watching, given that it is an hour and 20 minutes each, 2 of them per week, so that's like 3 hours, and you may not have time, and in any case you do need a bit of an overview, right? The bird's eye kind of a view of the subject, which I will give you every week in these lectures, which I will record this kind of old style again with the board and with just me talking and no PowerPoints and nothing like that. So hopefully it will also kind of make it a little closer to in-class experience, something you would normally see in the classroom, and unfortunately now you cannot, right? Okay, so let's look at the stuff we'll be covering this week. What is the important question here? What are we asking? We're asking, when did philosophy begin? And we are talking, of course, about Western philosophy. Obviously, and the book mentions that there's more to philosophy than just Western philosophy. There is also philosophy in China, in other parts of the East, and so on. But in this class, we concentrate on Western philosophy. Why? Well, for our purposes, it was most influential, right? The civilization we live in this country in particular, in the United States, is Western civilization. We live under the system known as capitalism. All of this is closely connected to this Western philosophy, so we should know it pretty well. And believe me when I tell you that it influenced everything around us, again, including the system we live under, the democratic system, democracy, and the economic system, capitalism. All of this is closely connected to Western philosophy. So when did it begin and how did it begin? This is the question for this particular part of the book, and we're starting with chapter 2. Why? Well, we can't do the entire book, right? There's more chapters there than we can possibly cover. I try to cover as many as I can, but you can already see it's a little bit crowded. It gets a little bit crowded in each lecture. You got too much to cover, and I don't want it to be insane. This is something I've been kind of struggling with a little bit throughout this course, which I've been teaching for years now. I want to give you as much as possible. I don't want it to get overwhelming. I know that it's easy to get overwhelming, especially for introductory course, so I have to make compromises. I have to remove some stuff. It all may be interesting. If you want to read chapter 1, be my guest. You have access to the book, you can do it on your own time. It talks about Buddhism, it talks about some of the other philosophies of the East. But we will skip that. We'll start with an introduction to classical philosophy, overview of classical themes, which is kind of a little chapter at the beginning there, and we jump straight to chapter 2. We'll be talking about chapter 2 mostly on Wednesday, but also a little bit on Monday, and this is during the discussions. However, we start with overview of the classical themes, and I hope that you have read this little piece by Hesiod, which I have posted on discussion board on Canvas. Why did I do that? Well, this is what I'm kind of looking for. It's a beautiful poem, and you guys enjoy it, and I'm glad that you do. But keep in mind one thing, it is not a philosophy. And this is why it's important to understand the difference between philosophy and the difference between this kind of poems and myths which were prevalent prior to the emergence of philosophy. And what is this difference? It's based on myth and it's based on tradition, the authority of people who lived before. this is what Hesiod basically doing. He's collected the stories he heard from the forefathers and so on. And he tried to make some sense out of them. And the attempt there is to explain, how did the world begin? How did our civilization begin? So he relies on the authority and he introduces it as a myth, which, as beautiful as it is a complete fiction, right? This is not how it really happened. You may think of it in these beautiful terms, and it can even enrich you in many ways. And it is, of course, all classical culture, which, along with Homer, students do study, especially in more traditional type of ancient philosophy courses. Nonetheless, there has to be an understanding about how is that pre-scientific, or you may even say anti-scientific, anti-philosophic view is different from scientific and philosophical view of the later period. The book talks about the first philosophers, monists, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. These three we call Ionians. They are fundamentally different, and even though there is, of course, some similarity between them, there is one crucial difference. What is this crucial difference? They started using reason, they started rejecting authority and rejecting tradition. What they're doing now is trying to figure it out for themselves. They're looking for explanations based on reason. Now, when did Western philosophy begin? Can we put a date on it? Of course, it's difficult to put a date. It was kind of emerging, slowly emerging. But there is one date we can actually name. And this is 585 BC. So precise. What is this date? What do we know about this date? We know about it because it has been mentioned by Herodotus that Thales predicted solar eclipse in that year. He probably did not predict the exact date. We don't know exactly how he even did that. However, there were ways when they could more or less figure it out based on observation of how often do solar eclipses occur. And since Herodotus tells us that he did, and that actually indeed happened in that year, and now astronomers were able to figure out exactly which eclipse they're talking about. So that's why we know this exact year. They obviously did not have such a great account of that. We can name this date as the beginning of philosophy and science. And for our purposes right now, philosophy and science is more or less the same thing. We do not really distinguish them because, like I told you before, it took centuries and in fact thousands of years before they started to separate. For a long, long time, philosophy was science and science was philosophy. Philosophers were trying to figure out scientific laws and were doing what scientists are doing today, and vice versa. So that basically was the same thing. Philosophers were the scientists. Now the date would be 585 BC. By the way, what does it mean BC? Well, for those of you who do not know, let me explain. We are counting days now from the birth of Christ. Supposedly the birth of Christ happened what you may call year zero, even though there's no year zero. And today we have the year 2021 since the birth of Christ, or our era. Now, of course, there were people living before that. So how do you calculate points in time which are before this first year of our era? And by the way, it's typically, we call it CE, Common Era. How do you do that? Well, you have to go backwards in this way. And so, starting from this year zero, you are counting backwards. So whereas here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, here you will have 1 before Christ, 2, 3, and so on. So it's kind of the other direction. So the year 585 BC, before Christ or before Common Era, would be 585 years before the birth of Christ, which of course happened 2021 years ago, which of course together would give us what? 2600, 2021 plus 585, because note that they are going in opposite direction. So if we want to know how long ago this happened, 2606 years ago. So in other words, he said roughly 585 we will have a solar eclipse. People were quite amazed. Note that the only way to do that was certainly not to pray to gods and not to perform some sort of religious ceremony. The only way to know that was to use some sort of scientific method, to look at these patterns in nature around us, which could give us a certain indication as to what to expect. And this is exactly what Thales did. We do not know exactly what his philosophy was, because unfortunately none of his works survive. We only know some stories told and retold over time. However, it is being said that he was looking for, and this is one of the first Greek words we should know, arche. What exactly is arche, and why do we say it in Greek rather than in English? Well, Greek words, the way, especially ancient Greek words they were spoken at the time, do not align very well with the modern English language. Unfortunately, in English we use words in a somewhat different way. So for us to understand those Greek words, we are better off using the Greek words and just understanding their meaning. So what does arche mean? Well, one way to translate it is the beginning. However, the English word beginning does not give us full range of the meaning. Essentially for the Greeks, arche meant not just the beginning, but the most fundamental thing, something which is at the core of everything. So essentially what we today would say the smallest particle of some sort. What is reality made of? Where did reality originate? So Thales, as well as two other Milesian philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, all three of them were what is known as monists. They thought there is one underlying structure of reality, and they thought that they all had their own ideas about it, but they were all calling it arche. So what was arche? Note that this is actually the kind of question we still are wondering about today. What is the underlying element of reality? What is in there, in everything around us? Note that, as we will be talking about a little bit later, for a long time people thought atoms. Atoms were these smallest particles of reality. Then we split the atom, right? We did find out that you can split it and you will find electrons and a nuclear which has protons and neutrons. So this the smallest particles. No, it turned out, again going into modern physics, that there are quarks. Quarks are fundamental elements of the fundamental elements. Are the quarks the smallest? Now again, if you watch the Big Bang Theory, they're actually they're talking a little bit about this, and the smallest element which we today consider possibly to be the fundamental element, you may say type of an arche, would be the string. The string theory tells us that inside the quarks there are strings. Of course, whether or not it's the smallest element we don't know, because we cannot go to that level, and it leaves some of the problems along with it. So there's actually a lot more to this question in physics today than I can possibly tell you, especially since I'm not a physicist. However, the idea is still the same. What is that stuff of which everything is made? And that stuff, known to the Greeks as arche, all three of them had different ideas about what it is. So Thales in particular thought it was water. He thought it was water because apparently, at least as Aristotle, who lived approximately 250 years later, tells us, he thought it was water because you can find water inside all living organisms. So it must be the most fundamental. Now, Anaximander actually disagreed. He's a student of Thales, and he nonetheless had his own idea. He thought it was apeiron. What is apeiron? That actually is another Greek word, and basically what it means, peiron in ancient Greek means some sort of boundary. Apeiron means something which does not have a boundary. So some of the words we can use in English to translate it would be infinite or unlimited, and it really does not tell you exactly what he meant, but gives you slightly an idea. So it is some sort of stuff which does not have any boundaries and which is essentially infinite, not only in size, because it's everywhere, but also in microstructure, so to say. That weird stuff, he thought, makes more sense than water, because there gotta be something really invisible for us. So that was a disagreement Anaximander had with his teacher. Now, strangely enough, his student Anaximenes also disagreed with his teacher Anaximander in turn, and decided that perhaps apeiron is not the best option either, because we don't even know what it is. And so his idea was that it is air. So while for Thales it was water, for Anaximander it was apeiron. For Anaximenes it was air, just air. He thought it makes sense that air would be the most fundamental stuff of which everything is made. Why did he think it was air? Well, one of the explanations could be we breathe air, right? We live with air. If you don't have air, you will die. So he thought it must be something within the air which actually makes us alive, or any other living creature for that matter. In fact, even if you take plants and you somehow take away their air, like you put them in a bottle and close it up, they will die. And humans will certainly die. And he thought for this reason, air, it's so pervasive. It can pretty much go anywhere. So that must have been that most fundamental element, the arche. But none of them thought that it may be more than one element, which is why they're known as monists. Now the next philosophical figure which we should definitely mention would be Xenophanes. Xenophanes wasn't as much a philosopher, he was a poet too, but he was a very different type of a poet from Homer and Hesiod. Xenophanes, who lived quite a bit later than Homer or Hesiod, completely disagreed with them about one important subject, about the gods. He thought that it doesn't make any sense for us to think that gods would be multiple and that they would be kind of like us. Here's what he was saying. This is some quotes from Xenophanes. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things, whether matters of reproach and censure among men, theft, adultery, mutual deception. Men suppose that gods are brought to birth and have clothes and voice and shape like their own. But if oxen and horses or lions had hands, or could draw and fashion works as men do, horses would draw the gods shaped like horses, and lions like lions, making the bodies of gods resemble their own forms. So note that his criticism is that we are trying to think of gods in the same way as we look at ourselves. But should gods really be exactly the same as we are? Probably not. So he thought that it's more likely that there is one God, one all-powerful God, not multiple human-like gods. He was saying God is one, greatest among gods and men, in no way like mortals, either in body or in mind. He sees as a whole, perceives as a whole, hears as a whole. Always he remains in the same place. So he's not running around the mountains or something. Not moving at all, nor indeed does it befit him to go here and there at different times. But without toil he makes all things shiver by the impulse of his mind. So he is all powerful, and he is not really like a grandpa sitting in one spot. This is more of some sort of a superhuman force which controls everything, and yet it's not as a human being in any way. However, note that another important difference here, that he is also not like humans, not just in terms of the way he looks, but in terms of the way we look at somebody as a good person. So he is greatest among gods and men. Why is he saying gods and men? That kind of gives you an idea that there are multiple gods. Well, he actually probably uses just a figure of speech, because at the time everybody thought there were multiple gods. However, looking at his work, he did not, of course, he would not agree that there are multiple gods. It's just a figure of speech for him. He thought there was one great God. And we are talking about way before Christianity. We are talking about roughly, well, these works were probably roughly 550, 520 years before Christ. That's when they were written. So this is one important idea which Xenophanes had. Another important idea relates to what we mentioned last time, epistemology. What did we say epistemology was? Epistemology in philosophy is a theory of knowledge. So what did Xenophanes think about theory of knowledge? He was one of the first, you may say, skeptics, people who don't think we can have a complete knowledge. His exact words, or at least the words which we think are his exact words, because again, we don't have his actual work, but we have copies of it made over the centuries by other people. So the words which attributed to him, and probably are his own, would be, "No man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows the clear truth about gods, and about all things I speak of. For even if a person should in fact say that what has come to pass, nevertheless he himself does not know. But in all cases it is opinion that has been wrought." So basically he is making a distinction. Note that this is an important distinction which will again come back later, between a certain state of affairs, let's call it P, being true, and somebody, say Xenophanes, correctly believing that P is true, and that certain person knowing P. So what does it mean for somebody to know P? It's not enough for P to be true, and it is not enough for that P to be correctly believed. So let me give you an example. Let's say I correctly believe that there is a dog in the apartment next to mine. I just believe it. I think there is a dog. Let's say there actually is a dog there. Does it mean I know there is a dog? No, I don't. What's missing here? Justification. I do not have any justification. I simply believe, and my belief coincides with the fact that there is a dog. In order for me to say I know there is a dog, I have to have a certain justification. What could be a justification? Well, let's say I hear barks coming from that other apartment. Then I'm justified to say, well, that seems to me that there is indeed a dog there. Note that they again can be wrong. Maybe they're watching TV and that's just a dog barking on the television, not their dog. It's possible, but at least I will have justification, and based on this justification, my belief, if it happens to be true, will be considered knowledge. Now, of course, note that if my belief is not true, if there actually is no dog, that under no circumstances would that be knowledge. You cannot say that somebody has knowledge if they do not, if what they believe in is not actually true, even if they have very good justification. But I mean, even the very good justification can still be wrong. Suppose I heard the dog there. Suppose somebody told me the dog is there, and I have this belief, but the dog is not actually there. Maybe I was lied. Maybe again, what I heard was wrong. As long as that is not true, we cannot say I have knowledge of it. And Xenophanes was one of the first who actually said that, who actually suggested that. Okay, the last philosopher we will talk about today, and we will continue next time, but this one is one of the most interesting and most important ones, and his name is actually Heraclitus. Very influential, very interesting philosopher. He is considered transitional between Ionians, who we've been talking about today, and the ones come from a different part of Greece, from what today is actually Italy, Eleans. So, who was Heraclitus? Why is he so interesting? He probably was an aristocrat. He comes supposedly from the royal family, but he never wanted to be a ruler or a politician. He was a philosopher, and one of the most important, most interesting contributions Heraclitus has requires us again to use a Greek word. That word is logos. I spelled it in Greek, and in English this is Greek, because I wanted to give you guys this whole quote, and it is actually a very interesting quote. Let's look at it. En arche hen ho logos. That is how it reads in Greek. You probably noticed the word arche. Remember what arche means. Beginning. En arche, in the beginning. But how about the rest of it? Where is this from? As soon as I tell you where it is from, you'll probably figure out what it means. It comes from John 1:1, from New Testament. I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but New Testament of the Bible is actually written in ancient Greek, or rather in Koine Greek. Koine Greek is kind of a slightly more modernized version of the ancient Greek, because it's the same language, but we're talking about time around the birth of Christ, after the birth of Christ. So we're talking about a few hundred years later. Ancient Greek or Attic Greek has slightly evolved by this time. Nonetheless, it is essentially the same language. Words are pretty much the same. Arche is still the beginning. So at the beginning there was word. So for those of you who know Bible, know John 1:1, you probably can even say what follows that. At the beginning there was word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. Now, word, English word word, stands in the translation for a Greek word logos. Fair enough, you can translate it as word, but it actually is a lot more complicated, because in Greek, even though you can say logos and mean word or what is spoken, logos actually has several other meanings. It, among other things, could stand for the definition of something. What is its logos? And you give a definition of what it is. It can also mean reason, reasoning, rational foundation. So note that when you read the whole thing in Greek, that actually has several layers of meaning. And archaiologos would essentially mean at the beginning, but it would also mean at the core of everything. The most fundamental part of everything is logos. And logos could mean word, but it could also mean reason. And that reason was with God. And that reason was God. So for Heraclitus, logos is a very important part of reality. In fact, two other things which we can immediately mention about his philosophy as far as we know it is everything changes, everything flows. He is famous for supposedly saying you cannot step into the same river twice. There's actually a debate among experts whether or not he said it and in what way, but nonetheless it is universally agreed that he was saying everything changes. Everything changes around us. There's no one thing we can see around us which stays the same, including you or me. We're changing every moment. We are not the same today as we were 10 years ago. We are not the same today even as we were yesterday. Something has changed, hasn't it? Yet we talk about us as the same person. Same thing with the river, say Mississippi River. You know the water actually flows by, and it's not the same water today as it was yesterday. It's not even the same water now as it was 10 minutes ago. So then, how come we call it still Mississippi? How come I am still the same person I was 10 years ago? What is there? What doesn't change? And Heraclitus would say logos. Logos is the only thing which doesn't change. However, it is not material. It is not matter. So note that now we are actually stepping away from this monism, from thinking of arche as one thing. He also considered arche, he actually was talking about fire, changing fire, but he did not mean fire as some sort of physical entity. To him, fire was more of a symbol of something which, same as logos, is a rational core of reality. The rational core of reality doesn't change, but it's not material. What is it then, if it's not material? Now that's when we will have to go to Elia, to the next step in philosophy, where more interesting and exciting ideas started to emerge. Another interesting part of Heraclitus' philosophy, which we should probably mention before we end our lecture today, is unity of opposites. He thought within everything there are two opposing forces. It is backwards turning attunement, that of a bow and the lyre. What is he talking about? What the hell does that mean? Well, of course, his language is very obscure, and it's not for nothing that he was known as obscure. But what he means is, within a bow, the bow the archers use, and a lyre, the instrument they were playing, there is tension, there's constant tension. And it's only this tension which makes them what they are. That tension is a unity of opposites. These opposites are trying to rip apart, but in the same time, it is that force which is trying to rip them apart, which is what makes them what they are. What an amazing idea. Within everything, he is saying, there's this opposing forces, war and peace, day and night, hot and cold, and it is only the unity of them which makes this world. To understand this world, you have to understand that there is two opposing poles, two opposing forces within everything, and it's only these two forces together which makes the reality. Good and evil. He's saying there's no good and evil for God. There's only good and evil for human beings who perceive some things as good and some things as evil, because again, we need to understand the world as these two opposing forces. But for God, there really is, everything is good. Because if we could look at the things from God's perspective, we would understand that everything is the way it actually is supposed to be. Okay, so all this stuff is actually leading us towards the core of the Greek philosophy, which we will talk about later, and it is all important. It will kind of come back in turn, but nonetheless, this is some stuff you should know and understand at this point, but I guess for now this is enough. This is all I need for this first lecture, and next time we will continue talking about those early Greek philosophers, and we will get to Elia and see what other ideas did they come up with. Okay, thank you guys very much. I hope you enjoyed it. This is all for now.